Black Waitress answered a call in Dutch in front of a billionaire. Then he sent for her. The words flowed like water. Ja, ik begrijp het. And in that moment, Vincent Hartwell's silver fork froze halfway to his mouth, his billion-dollar empire suddenly feeling small compared to the mystery serving his table. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. But let's rewind 12 hours earlier, when the day began like any other at Le Bernardin's sister establishment in downtown Manhattan, where crystal glasses caught morning light like captured diamonds and the scent of fresh orchids masked the underlying tension of a kitchen preparing for another day of perfection. Vanessa Williams moved through the dining room with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible while remaining indispensable. Her black uniform was pressed to perfection, not a thread out of place, because she couldn't afford for anything to be out of place. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that transcended her circumstances. High cheekbones that spoke of strength, dark eyes that held depths no one bothered to explore, and hands that moved with an educated precision most people missed entirely. She balanced 4 plates along her left arm with the ease of a practiced dancer, each dish worth more than most people spent on groceries in a week. The seared foie gras glistened under the soft lighting, the truffle risotto steamed with aromatic perfection, and the wine pairings awaited tables filled with people who would never wonder if their server had eaten that day. Table 7 needs their wine refreshed, called Marcus, the maitre d', his voice carrying the particular brand of urgency that came with managing Manhattan's elite. And Mrs. Pemberton is asking about gluten-free options again. On it, Vanessa replied, her voice steady and professional, hiding the fatigue that lived in her bones. She had worked a double shift yesterday, picked up an extra lunch shift today, and would probably work late into the evening. The mathematics of survival required such calculations. Rent was due in 6 days, her mother's medication needed refilling, and her younger brother's college textbooks weren't going to buy themselves. What do you think drives someone to hide their true abilities? Share your thoughts in the comments about times when you've had to downplay your talents. She moved toward table 7, where Mrs. Pemberton, old money, older opinions, waited with the patient impatience of someone accustomed to having her needs anticipated. As Vanessa explained the gluten-free options for the 3rd time this month, her mind wandered to the linguistics textbook hidden in her locker downstairs. Dutch grammar patterns, specifically. She had been working through advanced syntax structures during her breaks, the complexity a welcome escape from the simplicity expected of her here. 3 years ago, she had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in applied linguistics and international business from Columbia. She spoke 5 languages fluently and could navigate 6 more with confidence. She had dreamed of working for the United Nations, of bridging cultures and facilitating understanding between nations. Instead, she served overpriced fish to people who looked through her as if she were merely part of the furniture. The economic realities had hit like a tsunami. Her father's sudden death had left medical bills that swallowed her small savings. Her mother's depression medication wasn't covered by insurance. Her brother's scholarship only covered tuition, not living expenses. So Vanessa had done what millions of educated people do when life refuses to align with dreams. She took whatever work would pay the bills and told herself it was temporary. That was 18 months ago. Now, as she refilled water glasses and memorized wine preferences, she sometimes wondered if temporary had become permanent without her noticing. The other servers were kind enough, though none suspected that their colleague could discuss Shakespearean influences in modern Dutch literature or analyze the social-linguistic implications of code switching in multilingual communities. At 2:47 p.m., during the brief lull between lunch and the early dinner crowd, Vincent Hartwell walked through the restaurant's heavy glass doors. Vanessa noticed him immediately, not because he was handsome, though the silver at his temples and the way his tailored suit moved with his body certainly didn't hurt, but because of how he moved through space. There was something different about people who had never worried about money, a particular relationship with gravity that spoke of confidence built on bedrock rather than shifting sand. Vincent Hartwell, though she didn't know his name yet, owned 17 companies across 4 continents. His great-grandfather had emigrated from the Netherlands in 1923 with nothing but determination and a gift for seeing opportunity where others saw only problems. 3 generations later, the Hartwell family name graced buildings, foundations, and business schools. Vincent himself had expanded the family fortune into technology, sustainable energy, and international development. He requested a corner table, as he always did when dining alone, which was most of the time. At 42, he had learned that solitude was preferable to the performance required of most social interactions. Business dinners were necessary evils. Charity galas were obligatory theater. But lunch alone with a good book was one of the few remaining pleasures that money couldn't complicate. Vanessa approached his table with the careful neutrality she had perfected. Present but not intrusive, attentive but not familiar. "Good afternoon, sir. May I start you with something to drink?" He looked up from his phone briefly, the glance efficient and impersonal. "Sparkling water, no ice. And I'll need a few minutes with the menu." "Of course." She moved away, already forgetting his face the way she had learned to forget all their faces. Customers were temporary weather patterns, some pleasant, some stormy, all passing through without lasting impact. What she didn't see was how Vincent's eyes followed her movement across the room, noting the controlled precision in her steps, the way she seemed to calculate angles and timing like someone solving complex equations in real time. There was something about her bearing that suggested depths beneath the surface, though he couldn't articulate exactly what had caught his attention. The afternoon proceeded according to its usual patterns. Vincent ordered the day's special, seared scallops with cauliflower puree, and lost himself in a biography of Dutch resistance fighters during World War II. Vanessa attended to her tables with practiced efficiency, her mind partly occupied with declining verb conjugations and the phonetic evolution of Low Dutch dialects. Neither had any reason to suspect that their carefully maintained worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way. At exactly 3:23 p.m., Vanessa's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her heart jumped. It was Dr. van der Berg, her former linguistics professor, calling from Amsterdam. They had maintained a correspondence about her thesis research on language preservation in immigrant communities, and she had been waiting for news about a potential research position at the University of Amsterdam. The restaurant was quiet, most tables finishing their meals, and she stepped toward the alcove near the restrooms where staff often took personal calls. Vincent's table was nearby, but he appeared absorbed in his book, his water glass nearly empty. She answered in Dutch, her voice immediately transforming from the careful neutrality of professional service to the warm fluency of intellectual passion. "Professor van der Berg. Ik had niet verwacht dat u vandaag zo bellen." Vincent's fork stopped moving. "Ja, ik heb de documenten doorgenomen die u heeft gestuurd. Het onderzoek naar teelbehoud in Nederlandse gemeenschappen in Amerika is echt fascinerend." The book in Vincent's hands might as well have turned to dust. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, the same musical cadence, the same careful pronunciation that marked educated Amsterdam Dutch rather than the rural dialects his great-grandfather had spoken. Vanessa continued, unaware that her world was shifting. "De methodologie die u voorstelt zo werkelijk baanbrekend kunnen zijn voor het begrijpen van hoe gemeenschappen hun culturele identiteit behouden." Vincent found himself leaning forward, straining to catch every word. She wasn't just speaking Dutch, she was discussing advanced academic concepts with the fluency of someone who understood not just the language but its cultural and intellectual contexts. The conversation continued for several minutes, covering research methodologies, grant applications, and the politics of academic publishing. When she finally hung up, Switching back to English to check on nearby tables, Vincent sat in stunned silence. The woman he had barely noticed, who he had automatically categorized as simply part of the restaurant's efficient machinery, had just conducted a sophisticated academic discussion in his great-grandmother's native tongue. For the first time in years, Vincent Hartwell found himself genuinely curious about another human being. He watched her move through the remainder of her tasks, seeing her now with completely different eyes. The way she carried herself, the quick intelligence in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the careful control that suggested someone used to hiding her true nature, it all made sense now. As he prepared to leave, signing the check with his usual generous tip, Vincent made a decision that would surprise even him. Instead of walking away and forgetting about the intriguing waitress, he asked to speak with the manager. "I'd like to know about one of your servers," he said quietly. "The young woman who was working the corner section. I believe she was handling my table." The manager, recognizing both the expensive suit and the tone of someone accustomed to having requests fulfilled, nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. That would be Vanessa. Is there a problem?" "Quite the opposite," Vincent replied, his mind already forming plans that would have seemed impossible an hour earlier. "I'd like to arrange a meeting with her. Tomorrow, if possible." As he walked out into the Manhattan afternoon, Vincent felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the electric anticipation of a mystery about to unfold. Behind him, Vanessa continued serving tables, unaware that her world was about to change forever. The next morning arrived gray and unforgiving, Manhattan's skyline shrouded in the kind of mist that made even the most optimistic New Yorker question their life choices. Vanessa stood at her kitchen window, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching the city wake up through rain-streaked glass. Her phone conversation with Professor van der Berg had left her mind spinning. The research position in Amsterdam was real, fully funded, with the potential to change everything. But it would mean leaving her mother, her brother, the carefully constructed safety net of predictable paychecks and familiar struggles. The application deadline was in 2 weeks, and she still hadn't told her family about the possibility. The apartment around her told the story of someone making the best of limited options. Books were stacked in every available corner, linguistics texts, philosophy, literature in multiple languages, creating towers of knowledge that seemed to mock the modest furniture and the persistent drip from the bathroom faucet she couldn't afford to fix. Her Columbia diploma hung on the wall beside a family photo, both serving as daily reminders of dreams deferred and responsibilities embraced. Her mother's voice drifted from the bedroom, talking to someone on the phone, probably her sister in Atlanta. The conversation was punctuated by the familiar sound of pill bottles rattling, the morning medication routine that had become as essential as breathing since her father's death. Vanessa had calculated that between her mother's prescriptions and her brother's textbooks, she was roughly 3 paychecks away from financial disaster at any given moment. She was reaching for her work uniform when her phone rang. The restaurant's number flashed on the screen, which was unusual. They typically only called if there was a schedule change or an emergency. Vanessa. It was Janet, the assistant manager, her voice carrying an odd mixture of excitement and confusion. "I have a strange request. There's a man here who wants to meet with you. Says he was a customer yesterday." Vanessa's stomach dropped. In 18 months of restaurant work, she had learned that when customers asked to meet servers privately, it rarely led anywhere good. Did he say what it was about? Did I do something wrong? No, nothing like that. Actually, he seems very important. Expensive suit, confident manner, and he left a very generous tip yesterday. He's asking if you'd be available to meet this afternoon. Says it's regarding a professional opportunity. The words "professional opportunity" hung in the air like a question mark. Vanessa found herself gripping the phone tighter. Did he give his name? Vincent Hartwell. He left a business card, And honestly, Vanessa, I looked him up online. This guy owns companies. Plural. Big companies. Vanessa's mind raced through yesterday's interactions, trying to remember every detail of every table she had served. Vincent Hartwell, the name meant nothing to her, but the corner table came back in fragments. Quiet, well-dressed, absorbed in his book. She remembered refilling his water glass, remembered his polite but distant demeanor. What could he possibly want? He wants to meet here, she asked. No, he gave me an address. Some office building in Midtown. Very official-looking business card. Look, I know this is weird, but he specifically said it wasn't personal, that it was about your qualifications for something. Maybe you applied for a job and forgot. Vanessa hadn't applied for anything except the Amsterdam position, and that was purely academic. The coincidence felt too strange to ignore, especially given the timing of yesterday's phone call. What time? He said 2 p.m. if you were available, 3 p.m. if you needed time to prepare. He seemed to understand that you might need to arrange coverage for your shift. The thoughtfulness of that detail struck her as odd. Most people who could afford lunch at their restaurant didn't typically consider the logistics of hourly employment. Tell him 3 p.m. And Janet, can you cover for me this afternoon? Already arranged. Vanessa, I don't know what this is about, but be careful, okay? And if it's something good, remember us little people. After hanging up, Vanessa stared at her reflection in the hallway mirror. The face looking back was familiar but somehow questioning, as if her own features were asking what she was getting herself into. She had learned to be suspicious of unexpected opportunities, particularly ones involving wealthy men and vague promises of professional advancement. But something about the formal approach, the business card, the careful attention to her schedule, suggested this might be different. And if Professor Vanderberg's research position was teaching her anything, it was that sometimes opportunities arrived disguised as impossibilities. Have you ever had a moment when a stranger noticed something about you that others missed? Tell us in the comments about unexpected recognition that changed your perspective. At 2:30 p.m., Vanessa stood outside a gleaming office building in Midtown, checking the address for the third time. The lobby was all marble and mirrors, the kind of space designed to make visitors feel either very important or very small. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a simple black dress that could pass for professional, her one good blazer, and shoes that didn't scream restaurant worker too loudly. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt like ascending into another world. Each floor number that lit up seemed to represent another layer of society she wasn't sure she belonged in. When the doors opened, she found herself facing a reception area that looked like it had been designed by someone who considered elegance a fundamental human right. Ms. Williams. The receptionist's smile was warm and genuine. Mr. Hartwell is expecting you. May I offer you something to drink? Coffee, tea, sparkling water. Water would be wonderful, thank you. As she waited, Vanessa tried to calm her racing thoughts by focusing on the details around her. The art on the walls was original, not prints. She could tell by the texture of the paint, the way light caught the brushstrokes. The furniture was the kind that looked simple but probably cost more than her annual rent. Everything spoke of wealth, but wealth with taste, wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Ms. Williams. She turned to find a man approaching with extended hand. Vincent Hartwell, she presumed, though he looked different outside the restaurant context. Taller than she remembered, with kind eyes that seemed to take in details without making her feel scrutinized. His handshake was firm but not performative, and he gestured toward an office that managed to be both impressive and somehow welcoming. "Thank you for coming," he said, settling into a chair across from her rather than behind his desk, a small gesture that immediately put her more at ease. "I imagine this seems rather mysterious." "A little," Vanessa admitted, then added with a slight smile. "But I have to admit you've got my attention." Vincent laughed, and the sound was genuinely warm. I suppose I should explain myself. Yesterday, when you took that phone call, you were speaking Dutch. The statement hung between them, and Vanessa felt her carefully constructed professional mask slip slightly. She had been so careful for so long to keep her world separate, to never let her education show through the uniform. Yes, I was. It's not just that you were speaking Dutch, Vincent continued, his voice gentle but intent. You were discussing complex academic concepts, research methodologies, cultural preservation, things that require not just language skills but deep intellectual engagement with the subject matter. Vanessa found herself studying his face, looking for signs of where this conversation was heading. You speak Dutch. My great-grandmother was from Amsterdam. She insisted the family maintain the language, though I'll admit my fluency isn't what it should be. But I heard enough to know that you're not just multilingual, you're academically trained in linguistics. The words felt like a key turning in a lock she didn't know existed. For 18 months, she had been invisible, competent but unremarkable, successful at hiding the very thing that made her exceptional. And this stranger had seen through her carefully maintained disguise in the space of a single phone conversation. I have a degree from Columbia, she said quietly. Applied linguistics and international business. Vincent nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. And you're working as a server because life happened. The words came out more honestly than she had intended. Family obligations, financial reality, the usual story of dreams meeting circumstances. May I ask what your plans are? Long-term, I mean. Vanessa hesitated. The Amsterdam opportunity felt too fragile to share with a stranger. But something about Vincent's directness invited honesty. There's a research position in Amsterdam. Language preservation in immigrant communities. The application is due in 2 weeks. That sounds exactly like the kind of work you should be doing. Vincent leaned forward slightly. Ms. Williams, Vanessa, I have a proposition for you. The word proposition carried weight that made her straighten in her chair. I'm listening. I've been looking for someone to head up our company's international community outreach program. Someone who understands not just languages but cultures. Someone who can build bridges between different communities and help facilitate understanding. The position would involve travel, research, working with cultural organizations and immigrant communities throughout the United States and internationally. Vanessa felt her heart rate accelerate. What kind of company? Hartwell Foundation focuses on sustainable development and cultural preservation. We work with communities to maintain their cultural identity while integrating into new environments. The position I'm describing would essentially be creating and running a new department. The scope of what he was describing felt almost too large to process. You're offering me a job based on overhearing one phone conversation? Vincent's smile was understanding. I'm offering you an interview based on overhearing one phone conversation. But yes, I believe you're exactly what we need. The question is whether we're what you need. Vanessa found herself thinking about her mother's medication, her brother's textbooks, the research opportunity in Amsterdam that seemed suddenly less like a choice between security and dreams and more like one option among several. What would the timeline be? Immediate, if you're interested. The department doesn't exist yet. You would be building it from the ground up. Salary would be competitive with your field. Full benefits, travel expenses covered, and considerable autonomy in how you structure the work. The offer felt surreal, like someone had reached into her most optimistic daydreams and made them tangible. But Vanessa had learned to be careful of things that seemed too good to be true. Can I ask why you're doing this? You don't know me. You have no idea if I'm competent, reliable, or even honest. Vincent was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. Yesterday, you were working a job that clearly doesn't challenge you, maintaining professionalism while managing what I suspect were significant personal pressures, and somehow still finding time to pursue academic interests in your spare time. You answered that phone call not because you had to, but because intellectual engagement matters more to you than convenience. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Vanessa felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. For so long, she had felt like she was living a divided life, her true self hidden away while she performed the role of someone with smaller ambitions. This stranger was offering her the chance to be whole again. "I need some time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Vincent handed her a folder she hadn't noticed before. "Here's more detailed information about the position, the foundation, and what we're hoping to accomplish. My direct number is in there as well." As she prepared to leave, Vincent stood and extended his hand again. "Vanessa, can I say something? Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden. Whatever you decide about this position, promise me you won't keep diminishing yourself to fit other people's expectations." Walking back to the elevator, folder in hand, Vanessa felt like the city looked different somehow. The same gray sky, the same crowded streets, but everything felt charged with possibility. In the space of one conversation, her carefully planned future had become beautifully uncertain. She thought about the Amsterdam research position, about this unexpected offer, about the life she had been building versus the life she might be able to create. For the first time in 18 months, the future felt like a choice rather than a surrender. The elevator doors closed, and Vanessa caught her reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back was the same person who had served lunch yesterday, but somehow she seemed more solid, more real, as if being seen for who she truly was had made her more herself. Tomorrow she would have decisions to make. Tonight, she would allow herself to imagine what it might feel like to use her gifts in service of work that mattered. The city hummed around her as she walked home, and for the first time in a very long time, Vanessa Williams felt like she was walking toward something rather than away from it. That evening, Vanessa sat at her kitchen table with Vincent's folder spread before her like evidence of an alternate reality. The Hartwell Foundation's mission statement spoke of cultural preservation, economic empowerment, and sustainable community development. Words that 3 days ago would have seemed like abstract concepts from another world. Now they felt like a roadmap to the life she had always imagined for herself. Her mother appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but with the determined grace of someone who refused to let depression steal her dignity entirely. Marianne Williams had been a social worker before her husband's death, someone who understood the weight of helping others while carrying your own burdens. The medication had helped stabilize her mood, but it couldn't erase the careful way she moved through the world now, as if she were afraid of disturbing something fragile. "You've been staring at those papers for 2 hours, her mother observed, settling into the chair across from her. "Either it's very good news or very bad news." Vanessa looked up, realizing she had been so absorbed in reading that she hadn't heard her mother's approach. "It's complicated. The best opportunities usually are." Marianne's eyes, still sharp despite everything, took in the official letterhead, the professional presentation. "Is this about that phone call yesterday? The one in Dutch?" Sometimes Vanessa forgot how much her mother still noticed, still processed, even when she seemed wrapped in her own struggles. "Someone overheard me talking to Professor Vanderberg, a customer at the restaurant. And he offered me a job. A real job. Running a new department for his foundation, working with immigrant communities, using my actual degree." The words felt strange in her mouth, as if speaking them might make them disappear. Marianne was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table, a habit she had developed during the worst days after her husband's death. "Tell me about the catch. Why do you assume there's a catch?" Because you're sitting here looking like someone offered you everything you ever wanted, and instead of being happy, you look terrified." Vanessa laughed despite herself. Her mother had always possessed an uncomfortable talent for seeing straight through to the heart of things. "The catch is that it's real. And if it's real, then I have choices to make. About Amsterdam. About Amsterdam. About you. About David's school expenses. About whether I'm the kind of person who takes risks or the kind who plays it safe." Marianne leaned back in her chair, studying her daughter with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read emotional weather patterns. "You know what your father would say. That security is an illusion anyway, so I might as well chase something that matters. He was a smart man, your father. Stubborn and optimistic to a fault, but smart." Marianne's voice carried the particular sadness of someone who still talked to a ghost. "Vanessa, sweetheart, you've been taking care of everyone for 18 months. Maybe it's time to take care of your dreams. But your medication, David's expenses, will figure themselves out. They always do." Marianne reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own. "You think I don't know what you've sacrificed? You think I don't see you reading linguistics books during your break at a job that barely uses half your intelligence?" The words hit harder than Vanessa expected. She had thought she was protecting her family by hiding her frustration, by making her sacrifices seem effortless. Instead, she had been protecting herself from the guilt of wanting more. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "Good. The things worth doing are usually scary." Later that night, Vanessa called her brother David at his dorm room at Howard University. At 21, he possessed the particular combination of idealism and pragmatism that came from growing up with limited resources but unlimited ambition. She found him studying for his pre-med exams, surrounded by the controlled chaos of textbooks and coffee cups that defined college life. "So let me get this straight," David said after she explained the situation. "Some billionaire overheard you speaking Dutch and offered you a dream job. That's an oversimplification, but essentially accurate. And you're calling me because I need to know that you'll be okay. Financially, I mean. If I take this job, I can help more, but there might be a transition period." "Vanessa." David's voice carried the patient exasperation of someone who had had this conversation before. "I have scholarships, work-study, and summer jobs. I'm not your responsibility. You're my family. That makes you my responsibility. No, that makes me lucky to have a sister who cares. But it doesn't make me an anchor around your neck." She could hear him shifting papers, probably highlighting something even as they talked. "You know what would actually help me? Having a sister who's doing work that makes her happy. The guilt you carry around is way more exhausting than student loans." The conversation stayed with her as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what her life might look like in 6 months. The Amsterdam research position felt safe in its familiarity. Academic, structured, building on work she already understood. The Hartwell Foundation opportunity felt like jumping off a cliff and hoping someone had remembered to pack a parachute. Meanwhile, across the city in his Tribeca penthouse, Vincent Hartwell was having his own sleepless night. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights and wondering if he had made a mistake. Not in offering Vanessa the position. Her qualifications were undeniable, but in the way he had approached it. Vincent had built his career on careful analysis, methodical planning, and strategic patience. He didn't make impulsive decisions, especially ones involving new hires for positions that didn't yet exist. But something about yesterday's encounter had bypassed his usual caution entirely. Perhaps it was hearing his great-grandmother's language spoken with such fluency and passion by someone who clearly understood its cultural weight. Perhaps it was recognizing something in Vanessa's careful composure that reminded him of his own early years in business, when he had learned to hide his ambitions to avoid seeming presumptuous. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that talent was being wasted, and he was in a position to do something about it. His phone buzzed with a text from his business partner and oldest friend, James Chen, who had been copied on the preliminary paperwork for the new position. Called the restaurant. Confirmed she's been working there 18 months. Columbia graduate, no disciplinary issues. Either you've found a diamond in the rough or you've lost your mind. Possibly both. Vincent smiled at the message. James had known him since their Harvard Business School days and was one of the few people who could challenge his decisions without diplomatic packaging. If James thought this was worth pursuing, that meant something. But it also raised questions Vincent hadn't fully considered. What if Vanessa declined? What if she accepted but the position didn't work out? What if his instincts were wrong, and he was simply projecting his own family history onto a situation that didn't warrant it? The next morning brought clarity in the form of routine. Vanessa arrived at the restaurant for her regular shift, but everything felt different. The familiar rhythm of taking orders and serving tables now felt like she was playing a role in someone else's life. Every interaction with customers carried the weight of potential. Was this her last week? Her last month? Was she serving lunch to someone who might, in another life, be a colleague? When facing a major life decision, do you trust your instincts or rely on careful analysis? Share your decision-making style in the comments below. Around noon, Janet pulled her aside with news that felt like the universe testing her resolve. 2 things. First, that Vincent Hartwell called again. Not pushy. Just wanted to make sure you had received all the information you needed. Very professional. And second, Mrs. Pemberton specifically requested you for her lunch party today. Table for 8, 3-course meal, and she's bringing what she described as very important business associates. Janet's expression suggested this was simultaneously an honor and a potential minefield. She said you were the only server who really understood her preferences. The irony wasn't lost on Vanessa. Mrs. Pemberton, who had never shown the slightest interest in her as a person, was now inadvertently illustrating the difference between being appreciated for her service and being valued for her capabilities. One was about performing a role efficiently. The other was about being seen for who she actually was. The lunch service proceeded flawlessly, as it always did. Vanessa navigated dietary restrictions, wine pairings, and the subtle social dynamics of business entertaining with the expertise she had developed over 18 months of practice. But as she served the final course, she found herself thinking about cultural preservation, language communities, and the work that was waiting for her in either Amsterdam or Manhattan. Mrs. Pemberton's business associates were discussing international markets, trade relationships, and the challenges of maintaining cultural authenticity in global commerce. They spoke around Vanessa as if she were part of the furniture, never suspecting that she could have contributed meaningfully to their conversation about European market penetration strategies or the nuances of cross-cultural communication. As she cleared the dessert plates, Vanessa made her decision. That afternoon, she called the number Vincent had provided. His assistant put her through immediately, as if he had been waiting for her call. Vanessa, his voice carried a warmth that felt genuine. I was hoping to hear from you. I have some questions about the position, she said, choosing her words carefully. Practical questions about timeline, expectations, and what success would look like in this role. Of course. Would you prefer to discuss this over the phone, or would you like to meet again? I could also arrange for you to speak with some of our current program directors, get a better sense of how we operate. The thoughtfulness of the offer struck her again. He wasn't pushing for a quick decision but rather ensuring she had the information she needed to make the right choice. I'd like to meet again. But this time, I'd prefer somewhere neutral. Not your office, not the restaurant. Somewhere we can talk as equals." Vincent was quiet for a moment, and she wondered if she had overstepped. Then he said, "There's a small cafe in Washington Square Park. Good coffee, quiet enough for conversation, and nobody there cares about business suits or uniforms. Would tomorrow afternoon work?" "Perfect." After hanging up, Vanessa felt a familiar sensation. The particular combination of anxiety and excitement that came with stepping toward an unknown future. She thought about her conversation with Professor van der Berg, about the Amsterdam research position that still awaited her response, about the life she had been building versus the life she might be able to create. That evening, she opened her laptop and began drafting 2 emails. One to Professor van der Berg, asking for a 2-week extension on the Amsterdam application deadline. The other to Vincent Hartwell, confirming their meeting and outlining the questions she needed answered before making her decision. As she typed, Vanessa realized that the choice she was facing wasn't really between 2 job opportunities. It was between 2 versions of herself, the careful version who planned meticulously and chose security, and the bold version who trusted her instincts and embraced uncertainty. For the first time in 18 months, she was excited to find out which version would win. Outside her window, Manhattan hummed with the energy of 8 million people making choices, taking risks, and building lives that hadn't existed the day before. Tomorrow she would be one of them. The future, uncertain as it was, felt full of possibility. The cafe in Washington Square Park existed in that rare category of New York establishments that managed to feel both timeless and contemporary. Tucked between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, it drew the kind of crowd that valued conversation over Wi-Fi and ideas over Instagram opportunities. Vanessa arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where she could watch the park's afternoon theater. Street musicians, chess players, students from NYU sprawled on benches with textbooks that probably cost more than she made in a week. She had chosen her outfit with the same care she might apply to a job interview, because in many ways, that's exactly what this was. Not the formal kind where someone evaluated her qualifications against a checklist, but the deeper kind where 2 people tried to determine if they could trust each other with something that mattered. Vincent arrived precisely on time, but instead of the polished businessman she had met in his office, he looked more like someone who belonged in the village's casual academic atmosphere. Dark jeans, a simple sweater, and an ease in his movements that suggested he was genuinely comfortable in environments that weren't designed to impress. "Thank you for suggesting this place," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I spend too much time in spaces that feel like stage sets. This feels real." Vanessa studied his face, looking for signs of performance or calculation, but found only what appeared to be genuine relief. "I needed somewhere I could think clearly. Your office is impressive, but it's also intimidating." "That's the point, unfortunately. Most of my business requires a certain amount of theater." Vincent gestured to the server, ordering coffee for both of them without the elaborate rituals that usually accompanied such decisions in his usual environment. But this conversation shouldn't be about power dynamics or intimidation. It should be about whether we can do something meaningful together. The directness of the statement caught Vanessa off guard. She had prepared for negotiation, for careful diplomatic language, for the kind of conversation where every word carried multiple meanings. Instead, Vincent seemed to be offering something much rarer: honesty. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, pulling out the notebook where she had written her questions. "Why does this matter to you? You could hire anyone, someone with more experience, someone who doesn't come with the complications of my situation. Why take a chance on a waitress who speaks Dutch?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table, a gesture that reminded her of her mother's nervous habit. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been present in their previous conversations. My great-grandfather arrived in New York in 1923 with $47 and a fierce determination to never be poor again. He spoke very little English, had no connections, no education beyond what he had learned working on his family's farm outside Utrecht. Vincent paused as their coffee arrived, using the interruption to gather his thoughts. He took whatever work he could find, construction, loading docks, anything that paid cash and didn't require perfect English. Vanessa found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite herself. He was brilliant, though. Could see patterns in markets, understand people's needs before they understood them themselves. But for the first 15 years in America, nobody saw past his accent, his clothes, his lack of formal credentials. He was invisible, just another immigrant doing manual labor. What changed? A warehouse fire. He was working as a night watchman, and when the building caught fire, he didn't just evacuate. He organized the response, coordinated with the fire department, saved the owner's inventory and probably several lives. Vincent's eyes held a mixture of pride and sadness. Suddenly, people could see what had been there all along. He wasn't just a foreign laborer. He was someone with intelligence, leadership ability, and a work ethic that could move mountains. Vanessa felt something shift in her understanding of the man across from her. And that's why you noticed me. I noticed you because you reminded me of every story my great-grandfather told about talented people being overlooked because they didn't fit expected categories. Vincent met her eyes directly. But I'm offering you this position because you're exactly what we need, not because I'm trying to correct some historical injustice. The distinction felt important, though Vanessa wasn't entirely sure why. Tell me about the work itself. Not the official description, but what it would actually feel like to do this job. Vincent's face brightened with the particular enthusiasm of someone discussing work that genuinely excited him. You'd be traveling to communities throughout the United States, and eventually internationally, where immigrant populations are struggling to maintain their cultural identity while integrating into new environments. Your job would be to understand their specific challenges, develop programs that preserve their traditions while creating economic opportunities, and build bridges between these communities and the broader society they're joining. That sounds like social work on a massive scale. It is. But it's also linguistics research, cultural anthropology, international business development, and policy advocacy rolled into one position. Vincent leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. For example, we're currently working with a Hmong community in Minnesota that's losing their traditional textile techniques because the younger generation can't see economic value in preserving them. Your job would be to figure out how to create market opportunities for those skills while maintaining their cultural significance. Vanessa felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of work she had dreamed about during her graduate studies. Practical application of linguistic and cultural knowledge that could actually improve people's lives. How much autonomy would I have in developing these programs? Complete autonomy, within budget constraints. You'd be building the department from scratch, which means you get to define how it operates, what partnerships we pursue, even how success is measured. Vincent paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Vanessa, I'm not offering you a job where you implement someone else's vision. I'm offering you the chance to create something that doesn't exist yet. The scope of what he was describing felt almost overwhelming. For 18 months, she had been executing other people's decisions, following scripts written by managers who had never worked in service, performing competence within carefully defined boundaries. The idea of having that level of creative control felt both thrilling and terrifying. What about Amsterdam? She heard herself ask. The research position there is exactly what I trained for, and it's with people I know, working on projects I understand. And it sounds perfect for you, Vincent said without hesitation. I'm not trying to talk you out of it. I'm offering you an alternative that might be even better." Vanessa appreciated that he didn't try to diminish the Amsterdam opportunity or pressure her toward his offer. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in helping her make the right choice, even if it wasn't the choice that benefited him. "Can I tell you what scares me about your offer?" she said. "Please." "It's too good. People like me don't get offered positions like this. We work our way up slowly, prove ourselves at every level, earn opportunities through years of documented competence." She gestured around the cafe, at the NYU students and village artists who seemed to move through the world with a confidence she envied. "I'm not used to anyone betting on my potential rather than my proven track record." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that surprised her. "Can I tell you what I see when I look at your track record? I see someone who maintained academic excellence while working multiple jobs to support her family. I see someone who earned a degree from one of the world's best universities despite significant financial obstacles. I see someone who has spent 18 months working below her capabilities without becoming bitter or giving up on her intellectual pursuits." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "But most importantly, I see someone who answered a phone call in Dutch because the conversation mattered more than convenience. That tells me everything I need to know about your priorities and your character." Vanessa felt tears threatening, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the experience of being truly seen by someone who had no obligation to notice her at all. Perhaps it was the realization that her careful composure hadn't hidden her struggles as effectively as she had hoped. Or perhaps it was simply the relief of having someone acknowledge that her choices had been difficult rather than easy. "What would the timeline be?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady. "Immediate, if you're interested. We'd start with a 3-month trial period. No commitment beyond that from either side. During those 3 months, you'd travel to 3 different communities, assess their needs, and develop preliminary program proposals. If it works out, we'd make it permanent with full benefits, competitive salary, and a budget for your department that would allow you to hire additional staff. And if it doesn't work out? Then you'd have 3 months of experience in exactly the kind of work you want to do, a professional reference that could open doors anywhere, and the knowledge that you took a chance on something important." Vincent's smile was encouraging rather than persuasive. Plus, the Amsterdam position would still be there. Vanessa found herself thinking about her mother's words. "The things worth doing are usually scary." This opportunity terrified her precisely because it offered everything she had ever wanted: meaningful work, financial security, and the chance to use her education in service of something larger than herself. "Can I ask you one more question?" "Of course. What happens if I'm not as good at this as you think I am? What if your instincts are wrong, and I can't handle the responsibility?" Vincent's response was immediate and certain. "Then you'll figure it out as you go, the same way everyone else does. Vanessa, competence isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being smart enough to learn from them and determined enough to keep improving." The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about salary, benefits, travel expectations, and the specific communities the foundation was currently working with. But underneath the logistics, Vanessa could feel something larger taking shape. Not just a job offer, but an invitation to become the person she had always believed she could be. As they prepared to leave, Vincent handed her another folder, this one containing letters from community leaders the foundation had worked with, describing the impact of their programs and the difference they had made in people's lives. "Take your time with this decision," he said as they stood outside the cafe. "But Vanessa, whatever you decide, promise me you won't stay invisible much longer. The world needs what you have to offer." Walking back through Washington Square Park, Vanessa felt the weight of choice settling around her like a new coat, unfamiliar but somehow perfectly fitted. The Amsterdam research position still called to her with its academic prestige and intellectual safety. But Vincent's offer promised something she hadn't dared to hope for: the chance to be fully herself in her professional life. That evening, she called Professor van der Berg in Amsterdam, their conversation flowing easily between English and Dutch as she explained her situation. His response surprised her with its enthusiasm for the Hartwell Foundation opportunity. "Vanessa," he said, "what you're describing sounds like applied linguistics research with the potential for real-world impact. The academic position will always be here, but opportunities to build something new, to bridge theory and practice, those are rare." After hanging up, she sat at her kitchen table with both folders spread before her, thinking about invisible potential and the courage required to make it visible. Outside her window, Manhattan hummed with the energy of millions of people making choices that would define their futures. For the first time since her father's death, Vanessa Williams felt ready to choose her own life rather than simply manage the one that circumstances had given her. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like recognition, the acknowledgement of something that had been true all along, waiting for her to be brave enough to claim it. She reached for her phone and dialed Vincent's number. "Vincent. It's Vanessa. Are you free to talk? I've made my decision." 6 months later, Vanessa stood in a community center in Pilsen, Chicago, watching Maria Gonzalez teach a room full of teenagers how to prepare traditional mole while explaining the historical significance of each ingredient. The cooking class was part of a larger program Vanessa had developed, one that preserved cultural knowledge while creating pathways to culinary careers, scholarship opportunities, and entrepreneurship. "The chocolate connects us to our Aztec ancestors," Maria was saying, her hands moving with the practiced grace of someone who had learned these techniques from her grandmother. "But the way we combine it with European spices tells the story of survival, of making something beautiful from collision and change." Vanessa made notes on her tablet, documenting not just the program's logistics but its deeper impact. In the past 6 months, she had developed similar initiatives in 8 different communities, from Somali refugees in Minneapolis to Vietnamese fishing families in Louisiana. Each program was unique, tailored to the specific needs and strengths of the community, but all shared the same core principle: cultural preservation could be economically empowering rather than economically limiting. The Hartwell Foundation's Community Outreach Department now employed 12 people across 4 regions, with partnerships spanning from universities to local businesses to federal cultural agencies. What had started as Vincent's instinct about a multilingual waitress had become a nationally recognized model for immigrant integration and cultural preservation. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother David. "Saw the Chicago Tribune article about your program. Mom has been showing it to literally everyone at the grocery store. You're basically famous now. Also, I got into Johns Hopkins for med school. Turns out having a sister who's changing the world doesn't hurt on applications." Vanessa smiled, remembering her fears about her family's financial stability. Her new salary had not only covered her mother's medication and David's expenses, but had allowed her to establish an education fund for her future nieces and nephews. More importantly, her mother's depression had lifted significantly, not just because of reduced financial stress, but because she was proud to see her daughter thriving. "Ms. Williams." Maria approached with a shy teenager in tow. "This is Sophia. She wants to study international business, but she was worried about losing connection to her culture." Sophia looked up with the particular mixture of hope and uncertainty that Vanessa recognized in herself from not so long ago. "My parents think if I study business, I'll become too American, forget where I come from. But I want to help communities like ours." Vanessa knelt to Sophia's eye level, remembering her own struggles with balancing ambition and family loyalty. "What if I told you that understanding business could help you preserve your culture more effectively than abandoning it? What if your education became a tool for protecting what matters to your family?" The conversation that followed was one Vanessa had dozens of times in the past 6 months. Helping young people see that success didn't require cultural amnesia, that they could honor their heritage while pursuing their dreams. It was exactly the kind of work she had always imagined doing, but better because it was real, immediate, and measurably effective. That evening, she video-called Vincent from her hotel room to debrief about the Chicago program. These weekly check-ins had become one of her favorite parts of the job, not because Vincent micromanaged, but because his genuine excitement about the work matched her own. "The cooking program is exceeding all projections," she reported, pulling up spreadsheets on her laptop. "We have a waiting list of 40 families. 3 local restaurants have expressed interest in partnering with us for apprenticeships, and the community college wants to develop a formal culinary arts program based on our model." "That's incredible," Vincent said, and she could see him taking notes on his end. "What about the language preservation component?" "Even better. The teenagers are actually teaching their parents English while the parents teach traditional cooking techniques. We're seeing improved family communication and cultural transmission simultaneously." Vanessa paused, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "Vincent, I've been thinking about expansion possibilities." "Tell me, what if we created a fellowship program? Bring young people from different immigrant communities together for intensive training in both cultural preservation and business development, then send them back to their communities as program leaders." Vincent's face lit up with the expression she had learned to associate with his best ideas. "That's brilliant. It would create a sustainable model that doesn't depend on outside expertise. How would you structure it?" The conversation continued for an hour, ranging from fellowship curriculum to funding strategies to potential university partnerships. What struck Vanessa most was how natural it felt. 2 people building something important together, each contributing their strengths to create outcomes neither could achieve alone. After they hung up, Vanessa found herself thinking about the trajectory of her life since that day in the restaurant. The Amsterdam research position was still available, and Professor van der Berg continued to send her updates about interesting projects. But the work she was doing now felt more vital, more connected to immediate human needs. She thought about Mrs. Pemberton, who had been oddly gracious when Vanessa gave her notice at the restaurant, even expressing regret that she had never realized her server's educational background. "I suppose I never thought to ask," she had said, which felt like the closest thing to an apology Vanessa was likely to receive. The next morning brought a surprise that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. Vincent called to inform her that the Hartwell Foundation had been invited to present their community outreach model at the United Nations Conference on Cultural Diversity and Sustainable Development. "They want you to be the primary presenter," Vincent explained over the phone. "Your work, your voice, your vision for how cultural preservation can drive economic development." Vanessa found herself speechless, standing in her hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. The United Nations, the organization she had dreamed of working for during graduate school, was now asking her to share work she had created. "Vanessa, are you there?" "I'm here," she managed. This is surreal." "You've earned this," Vincent said gently. "Every community you've worked with, every program you've developed, every life you've impacted, it all led to this moment." The presentation in New York 2 weeks later exceeded even Vanessa's most optimistic expectations. Standing before an audience of international development experts, cultural advocates, and policymakers, she felt the particular confidence that comes from discussing work you genuinely believe in. She told Sophia's story, Maria's story, the stories of dozens of families who had found ways to honor their heritage while building successful lives in America. She presented data showing how cultural preservation programs increased economic stability, educational achievement, and community cohesion. Most importantly, she demonstrated that diversity wasn't something to be managed or overcome, but something to be leveraged as a source of strength and innovation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 different foundations approached her about replicating the model internationally. A publisher inquired about turning her work into a book. 2 universities offered her adjunct professorships to teach courses on applied cultural linguistics. But the moment that mattered most came after the presentation, when a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "My name is Amara," she said, her accent marking her as recent immigrant, possibly from East Africa. "I am studying social work here, but my family thinks I am abandoning our traditions. Your presentation, it shows me that maybe I can do both." Vanessa felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with recognizing herself in someone else's struggle. You absolutely can do both. In fact, the world needs people who can do both. They talked for 20 minutes, Vanessa sharing resources and contact information, watching this young woman's posture straighten as she began to envision possibilities she hadn't known existed. It was exactly the conversation someone had needed to have with Vanessa 3 years ago, when she was struggling to see how her dreams could coexist with her responsibilities. That evening, Vincent took her to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy. Not to celebrate, he said, but to process what had happened and plan what came next. "How are you feeling?" he asked over wine that cost more than Vanessa used to make in a week, though she had long since stopped calculating such comparisons. "Grateful," she said after considering the question. "And maybe a little scared about living up to expectations." "Good. The day you stop being a little scared is the day you stop growing." Vincent raised his glass. To invisible potential made visible. As they clinked glasses, Vanessa realized that somewhere in the past 6 months, Vincent had become more than just her employer. He was a collaborator, a mentor, someone who challenged her thinking and supported her growth. There were moments, like this one, when she sensed the possibility of something deeper, though neither of them had addressed it directly. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. Do you ever regret taking a chance on me? I mean, you could have hired someone with more experience, someone who wouldn't have needed so much guidance in those first few months." Vincent's laugh was warm and genuine. "Vanessa, you've exceeded every expectation I had. But more than that, working with you has reminded me why I got into this work in the first place. You've made me better at my job." The words carried weight that felt personal as well as professional, and Vanessa found herself wondering what might develop between them as they continued building something meaningful together. 3 months later, Vanessa stood in her new apartment in Manhattan. Not the cramped studio she had shared with financial anxiety, but a spacious one-bedroom that reflected her transformed circumstances. The walls were lined with books in multiple languages, photographs from her travels to different communities, and framed letters from families whose lives had been touched by her programs. On her desk sat 2 items that represented her journey. Her Columbia diploma, finally displayed with pride rather than hidden in regret, and a handwritten note from Sophia in Chicago, now enrolled in business school with a full scholarship and plans to return to her community as an advocate for cultural preservation. Her mother called as she was preparing for another trip, this time to Seattle to work with a Hmong community developing textile cooperatives. "I've been thinking about your father," her mother said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "He would be so proud of what you've built. Not just the job, but who you've become in the process." "I hope so," Vanessa replied, looking out at the city that had once felt like an obstacle and now felt like home. "I know so. You know what he used to say about you when you were little? That you had the gift of seeing bridges where other people saw walls." After hanging up, Vanessa packed her suitcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make any place feel like home. Tomorrow she would fly to Seattle, where new communities were waiting for someone who understood that preserving the past and building the future weren't contradictory goals. Her phone buzzed with a text from Vincent. "Safe travels. Can't wait to hear about the textile cooperative project. Also, I have an idea about expanding into international refugee communities that I want to discuss when you're back. This work we're doing, it's just the beginning." As she looked out at Manhattan's lights stretching toward the horizon, Vanessa Williams felt the particular satisfaction that comes from living a life aligned with your values and your capabilities. The invisible waitress had become visible, not through anyone else's recognition, but through the courage to claim her own worth and use it in service of something larger than herself. The future stretched ahead, full of communities to serve, cultures to preserve, and bridges to build between who people were and who they could become. And for the first time in her adult life, Vanessa couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring. She had finally learned the secret her father had always known. The most meaningful transformations happen not when we change who we are, but when we become brave enough to be who we've always been. The conversation in Dutch that had changed everything was just the beginning. The real story was what happened when someone finally listened.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.